As a motion designer, I always face the problem with render times, and of course you can rent a render farm, but in this class I'll show you what tools and settings you can use in Redshift to optimize your render times and to shrink down the waiting time. And of course, even in renting render farms, it can save you a lot of money. So let's start to explore the techniques. Redshift is a powerful tool, especially when it comes to render optimizing. We can, on our render view, so we have some render, and by default you should check the render info is on, and we have not bucket rendering but progressive rendering. And for example, we have some settings by default. When we render this thing, we see that there are a lot of noise. Sometimes it can be tricky how to fix the thing. I'll show you the logic. We're going to samples mode, and you'll see that we have immediately bucket mode, this black and white image. The white zones shows where we hit maximum of our samples. Our logic is to get a gray image. For example, I up these samples, we see that we have less more noise. I'm going to brute force and maybe up this thing up. Our image became more clear. We can check it. So you remember the first attempt, the second, a lot cleaner shadows, but we have some issues with metals. Of course, you can go the hard way. You're going to our AOV manager, going to maybe diffuse, reflection, refraction, shadows. Oh, I think diffuse we don't need for now. And all other stuff, especially if you have volume rendering, etc. And you can check layers, and you can see which layer has the noise. But I prefer to simplify workflow. We're going to disable brute force for now, and we see that we have much clearer image because brute force insert a lot of noise. We can go and investigate what zone produce a lot of noise. As we see, we have noise in glass. Our shadows were almost clear. So we're going to sample overrides, go into reflection, and I pick our samples max and multiply by 4. We're going back to our samples, and our reflection start to gather a lot of more samples. We have these white zones, and the lowering the threshold, the more samples you get in noisy zone. For example, if I up it to very high level, we see that our white turns into gray. But when I lowering the threshold, we have our white come back into the scene. I suggest you to keep the balance, maybe using default adaptive threshold. And if you set samples over 4000, it's time to investigate. Do you meet adaptive error threshold in your scene? For example, maybe all you need to do is just decrease maybe in twice, and you don't need so much samples. I keep the default, up our samples, and we have some noise in refraction. Maybe I repeat this thing. Render. Of course, all this manipulation, gathering extended render time, but I'll show you the trick why we're doing this thing. So basic, a lot of noise, noise, noise. Improved, and our maybe final settings. And you see that in metal we have a clearer result. And after you did the basic settings, you're going to GI and work with brute force. The same logic, maybe twice, and hit render. Sometimes if you have long render time, you can change. We can render. I think a very good and clear result we have here, especially in this zone and in this. And we have, of course, drastically improve of render time. And sometimes just hit irradiance point cloud and it works better. Now you may ask, we have 24 seconds instead of 12. For example, here we have this 4 seconds 54. But let me show you one thing. Duplicate and set not optimized. Not optimized. 4.5 seconds. And now we're going to our sample overrides, disable this thing and set 2088 in our uniform. Let's check the time. 6 seconds. And let me render full res. This is our previous result. This is our unified sampling. You see that we have a lot of noise already and in shadows. And check the render time. We had 24 seconds and now we have much more time to render. Almost 35 seconds. 37. So this is the best thing that shows that using not only unified sampling, but analyzing your image and going to this sample overrides folder and up only samples you need to clear your image is a good way for optimization your render. And don't forget that we're starting with disable this GI. We're going to unified sampling, finding something in between, for example 4 and 256. Sometimes it can be higher, it depends on your scene of course, but we keep samples lower, going to sample overrides and up only samples we need to clear our scene. Shadows, maybe refractions or maybe lights, so shadows would be more clear, or maybe volumes or scattering. So this is the first lesson. The next scene, you see, this is a kind of bubble, will show you how we can optimize or we can play with Redshift 0.3022 and higher. There are two more new settings that we have here, and let me render. Before, while it's rendering, we're going to basic settings and just investigate what settings we crank up. We up samples max, reflections, and I have subsurface scattering. Going here. This is the logic I show you in first lesson. We're playing with samples, find the level, find proper error threshold value, and then going and upping samples we need. For example, we have a lot of reflections here, and we up them. 45 seconds. Now we go into system, and if you have RTX cards, you can enable RT support on your render cards. And we hit render. I think this technology will be improved again and again if you have 2000 plus family cards, maybe 2080, 2060 plus, and all that. You can get sometimes a great boost in render your scene. So we go into system, experimental options, and enable optics RT for on supported GPUs. We just set this thing on and we get reduced by 10 seconds. without losing quality. 1, 2. Beautiful. And the next thing is automatic sampling. What it does, it provides enough samples to meet adaptive threshold value. The lowering this thing is, the higher samples will be distributed to proper zones. Hit render and we check what we get. Of course, there is some preparing and these will not be optimized, and it depends on your scene. So every time you're working with render optimization, check all methods you can use before send to render farm or to final render. 32 seconds. I think this is a great improvement. And one thing I want to show you, that in our base settings we had a big amount of noise in some zones, and in automatic samples we can get a clear result. So these two options, enable optics RT and automatic sample, also can improve your render speed, even if you think you find the best values for separate sampling. Let's go to the next settings. Now we have very simple scene, and I want to show you the one more trick that is connected with bucket rendering. Let me set to bucket rendering, and you see that we have small buckets that goes in our scene and render it in 6 seconds, almost 7 seconds. Upping bucket size, and we have 4.5 seconds. And one more, the huge buckets, 4 seconds. So we goes from 7 seconds to 4 seconds. But sometimes you can find, let me disable bucket rendering, close this project, almost identical scene, but in the center we have very complex element and very simple at the side. So we can go to our buckets. I keep with 128, going to our rendering, and you'll see that they stuck with this element. You can think everything is not working, but it's okay. You can see the sound of your video cards, making you can check the temperature, rendering is going on, but it really stuck with element. While this card is rendering only one zone, the other card almost finished all the rest of the scene. We have 53 seconds. And sometimes you can go and decrease bucket rendering, so both cards will render the complex zone. You avoid situation when one card is rendering the maybe this transparency or maybe subsurface scattering, and the other card finished another regions and wait. It's very scene dependent and resolution dependent. It depends on how much cards you have. Sometimes it can work with lowering resolution. We can check 39 seconds and we had 54. And now I want to show you that the scene almost identical, but resolution is much higher, and we have 1 minute 34 seconds with big buckets, and with small buckets it doesn't render this thing in a half. Be sure to check different bucket size rendering, but in more cases the huge value will help you a lot of time. Let's go back to our bubble candy scene and check what we can get more with bucket size. We had our 45 seconds, 34 seconds, 33, and now we can go to just bucket size. I disable our IPR, hit render, and what result we can get. Here the render of our balls 32 seconds with small bucket and 20 seconds with bigger ones. And you see that sometimes in low resolution we can get improvements with small buckets, but in final resolution we have a lot of loss of time. We go into our sample scene, and now we have 32 seconds and had 33. So now you know that the logic is fighting with unified sampling. If you don't use depth of field or motion blur, you can go to sampling overrides, find the samples you need for your scene. Then you go into GI, go into brute force, and sometimes you can just hit irradiance point cloud. I don't change from default settings, and it gives you a lot of improvements, even in animation. Then in system, you can check, of course, optics RT, automatic sampling, and checking bucket size. So now you know all the tools which I use to optimize our render. And one more thing is that we have optimization settings. If you have not much reflections or refractions or transparency, you can decrease these values also to improve your settings. For example, we don't have refractions here, maybe we can decrease. We don't have transparency, and maybe we can lowering the reflections. Hit render, and sometimes it can gives you a much speed in rendering, but sometimes not. It depends on your scene, and render optimization is one of the not interesting part of motion design, but I think that cutting few seconds from each frame will save you a lot of time in rendering all sequence. You see that we get 30 seconds. Of course, we lost some. See here some reflections, but overall I don't see the much difference, and I prefer to render my sequence with 30 seconds per frame and not this 45. Thank you for your attention and have a nice day.